Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. I do appreciate that some of you, I know one or two people have even come in specially. They were on holiday today, which makes me really nervous. I said to Katie Barnett I was nervous this morning. She didn't believe me, but I am actually. I am quite nervous. Partly because I said to friends on Friday night that I wanted to come in today and announce the death of the university. I was looking to be as melodramatic as possible. I'm not quite going to do that, but the intention today is to be a little bit provocative, but there's a few little fun clips in as well, which hopefully will make you smile. It's billed as a Christmas, the first annual Christmas lecture, which means someone has to do one next year. It may be me, you never know. I'm going to, as I talk, mention a few things about the presentation, because it is, after all, the Centre for Learning and Development. I'm using a piece of mind mapping software. I decided not to use PowerPoint. And the notes that you have are actually all contained within this presentation. So everything that I'm going to say, effectively, apart from maybe the odd ad lib, will be in your notes, which is probably now too dark for you to read anyway. That's to stop you shuffling paper all the way through. But you don't feel you have to scribble anything down. I also would like, if possible, to ask your indulgence and allow me to do this as more of a lecture than a seminar, largely because I've only got about 35-40 minutes and time goes really quickly, and there'll be time at the end for you to ask questions, or at least to ask questions. I may have left the room because lunch is waiting, but there'll be an opportunity for you to have some kind of discourse at the end. I referred in the flyer to a book that came out in the early 90s called The Virtual Class, and it was provocative for lots of reasons. It was produced at the university that I was then working at, and it had at the front of one of its chapters this quote from Proverbs that without a vision the people would perish. And I went to my Bible to check the quote, and it was translated quite differently as where there's no prophecy, the people cast off restraint. And since it's Christmas, I thought, and I am, after all, a theology graduate, it occurred to me that maybe we'd start with something a little bit religious. I think it's interesting that the two quotes are different, but what I'm asking people to do is to take a prophecy, which I'm going to do today, and I would indeed like you to cast off restraint with that prophecy, so the absence of one isn't really the purpose. I've structured this in the sense there are some reflective questions, which are the little boxes in pink, and they're indicated on your handout. And what I would like to do is to ask you to reflect on those as we go. I would like you to think a little bit about perhaps what your own definitions of e-learning are, because they do vary. Every time I go to a GISC meeting or a higher education meeting, people say we're not going to discuss the definitions because it'll take too long, because even after 10, 15 years we still haven't really agreed on what we mean by these terms. But to maybe think a little bit about not only whether the definition you have works with your colleagues, but indeed whether it works with your students. I'm going to leave you with your own definition of e-learning rather than give you one. And instead, just think for a moment about the promise that we all got very excited by. Funding streams came along, policy documents were produced, all of which asked us to think about how e-learning was going to transform the way in which we did education. And many of you will have seen this technology adoption lifecycle before, but it suggested that we would move through these phases from innovation to early adoption into a period where the pragmatic majority would adopt the technology. And we can look at the patterns for things like PowerPoint adoption or the use of virtual learning environments, Blackboard for instance, and we can see very much that kind of curve. Of course, over time, these overlap as new technologies come along, and the shape of that curve changes dramatically. So sometimes the period for early adoption is extremely extended and so on. It's very difficult to get anyone to agree exactly where we are in e-learning because, of course, it contains so many things. And what I'd like to do is to just quickly look back on what we were saying about e-learning some time ago, maybe 10 years ago. People said that the value added for higher education would come in a similar way to business, which is that it would make capacity expandable. There'd be no limit to how much could actually be exchanged. It would be more easily accessible, and as a result everyone would be more productive and indeed have a very enjoyable time. All sorts of claims were made for e-learning and how it was going to transform people who had difficulty engaging in the learning process, that they would somehow be liberated and released. It also, of course, suggested, senior management were always rather pleased at the suggestion that it might actually reduce costs. I remember going to several conferences in the late 90s which were actually entitled E for expensive. And indeed, lots of e-learning appeared to be incredibly expensive if you were trying to replicate anything like the quality of a one-to-one staff-student ratio. Although I don't think we know the true costs of any of the learning and teaching we do, and that's another issue. But e-learning certainly hasn't produced those massive cost savings that everyone suggested it might. And it follows on from that there was this notion somehow it was going to massively improve productivity. What was suggested that in very broad terms was that it introduced the notion of flexibility for students. So students would find that they had access to a more flexible style of learning, and that this process would be cost effective for them as well as for staff. And it would give access to resources. Tina, do you want to come right to the front? And we get access to resources and therefore make the process of managing resources that much more efficient, because the same resource could be accessed by students remotely and simultaneously. In fact, what appears to have happened is that many of the quite rigid conventions that we have in our learning and teaching practice simply carried over into e-learning. I won't say it's the first provocative point, but this is one of the points that I wanted to make today. The notes, incidentally, which you see here, in case you're wondering what they are reproduced in your handout. These are actually the notes that are just embedded inside the presentation, and I'm hoping I won't have to refer to them because I have reread my own notes several times. So the conventions for learning spaces, it's worth, I think, thinking about some of the physical ones. Some room at the front, Deputy Vice-Chancellor. The conventions were that we had this very familiar structure to much of our learning engagement. And I'm not suggesting, of course, that it's exactly the same today. It's been radically transformed. It's now in colour. But there is so much of the face-to-face activity is still stuck in this very conventional mode. And my argument would be that e-learning in many ways has simply reproduced some of those conventions. So we started with computer-based training, CBT, and we worked on the basis that there was some information or some knowledge that needed to be exchanged, and it was put somehow into a computer, it was codified in some way, and an individual would sit down and receive that information, often in a very passive way. The first one dates back to something like 1959. There's a program called Plato, but lots of programs actually came into being and grew then massively, of course, in the 1980s with the development of the desktop computer in business in the late 80s, early 90s. I think what's interesting is to just think about whether, in fact, that changed anything about the nature of the learning engagement that students have. I think a lot of us will have done some kind of computer-based training. Judging by the age of the audience, I'll say no more. I'm sure many of us saw some of the earlier versions of computer-based training, not the very, very, very early ones, obviously, but some of those that came about in the 80s and 90s. And they were pretty dull, they were pretty dry. In fact, people say the same things about some e-learning experience now, so maybe we've just raised the bar. Of course, I have no doubt that this is going to change massively. I'd like to share this vision with you.
Computer, resume testing.
Who said logic is the cement of our civilization with which we ascend from EKS using reason as our guide?
T. Planahath, matron of Vulcan philosophy.
Correct. What is the molecular formula of aluminium sulfide crystals? White queen to section 5, grid 6, queen takes knight, rook takes queen, white pawn to section 5, grid 7, pawn takes rook. Checkmate. What significant contribution to bioengineering was made in Lucarian outposts on Clent?
The universal atmospheric element compensator.
Evaluate and conclude. A starship sensor is indicated as being pursued so closely that it occupies the same space as its pursuer. Correct. Identify object and its cultural significance.
Klingon mummification glyph.
What were the principal historical events on the planet Earth in the year 1987? Correct. What was Kira Kim Fa's first law of metaphysics?
Nothing unreal exists.
Correct. Adjust the sine wave of this magnetic envelope so that antineutrons can pass through it, but antigravitons cannot. Correct. What is the electronic configuration of gadolinium? Correct. How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
I do not understand the question.
I feel quite depressed, actually, at the thought that in the 23rd century, that might be the best that we can manage with computer-based training. It's interesting that it's very hard for people to imagine anything different. It's not actually that different to the kind of computer-based training we had in the middle of the latter half of the 20th century. So I ask whether or not those trends towards the conventional actually occur in virtual learning environments as well. And I think they do. I think actually virtual learning environments as they exist currently are really not terribly exciting places to be. They do certainly make some aspects of learning and teaching more convenient, but whether they've actually transformed the relationship of the instructor and the learner, I would question whether they do. The early VLEs were relatively two-dimensional. They didn't really have a great deal of opportunity for interaction. They simply presented resources. Increasingly, of course, there's a greater degree of engagement that's possible, and we're trying to pull some of those more discursive elements into the virtual learning environment. But it is still channeled. It's still being placed inside a channel of a particular system, a particular environment, which is managed. And I'm going to come back to that idea a little bit later. More recently, of course, there's been a lot of enthusiasm for the nature, the notion rather of discussion forums. They were a key part of virtual learning environments, but they're now increasingly being used independently of the virtual learning environment as standalone discussion forums, and people have got very excited about that. I would still question, in fact, whether that's a particularly novel or original way of engaging with students. It's certainly popular amongst quite a lot of students to be able to asynchronously engage with their peers and with staff, but it's still relatively passive in my terms. And I'm going to come back to some of these later when we talk a little bit about what the future of the VLE might look like. This is a discussion forum, by the way, not a policy forum, so you'll appreciate when I say the future of the VLE, that's not me making any institutional suggestions. I'm more concerned with making sure that the Vulcans have a decent system in place by the 23rd century. But if you think a little bit about your experience of e-learning and what you've done, and ask yourself whether, in fact, it did anything to transform your learning style. Did it transform your approach to learning, or did you simply squeeze yourself into that particular box or that particular channel for the duration of that particular program, and then go back to doing whatever it was you were doing? I was talking a couple of weeks ago to some students who were doing a course at another institution, a very large open institution, which provides a lot of their resources now online, and she said to me, well, the problem is it takes me a long time to print off the 480 pages so that they can take them to when the kids go swimming and sit and read them, which is her preferred mode of learning. Saving the Open University an enormous amount of money, of course, not having to send all this material out, but hasn't actually changed the way that the individual approaches the learning. So my questions are really whether or not e-learning is all the things that people are claiming that it is. Is it really flexible? I don't think it is terribly. It depends on your definition, of course, but with so much central provision within institutions, the question is, who's it flexible for? Students are often told, for instance, that they can't use their Yahoo account. They have to use their University of Hull account. Well, if I was a student, I wouldn't see that as being very flexible. I'm used to using my Yahoo account. I've had it for 15 years. I've had it since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm a very able user of that particular communication environment, and now you want me to learn another one. So where's the flexibility in that? So there is an issue about central provision, I think. There's also, we hear it all the time, this idea that actually it's not really about learning and teaching, it's about technology. And there's the issue, of course, of whether the users themselves are sufficiently skilled to actually use any flexibility that's built into the system. Usually they're not, and therefore the system is actually rigid because it's confined by the actual skill set of the individuals themselves. All those unskilled users, of course, make it actually quite inefficient, at least compared to how it could be. So Lynn Saville and I have constant conversations about the need to kind of upskill users in general sort of use of office environment tools, but it's true of the virtual learning environments as well, that actually used well, they would indeed perhaps be cost effective, but they're often used really quite badly. There's also an issue about whether it's cost effective in just terms of the software that you buy. Actually, the software itself is often really quite inexpensive when you compare it to other infrastructure that an institution has. It's interesting when institutions talk about cost per student. It really is in the kind of pounds. It's not £100 to provide these environments to students. It's usually £1, £2, £2.50. I think the most expensive costing we ever worked out for Merlin was about £2.84 or something per user, which doesn't strike me as massively expensive. But the overarching systems that are put in place to support them and the staff needed to provide the skill and to provide the pedagogical insight in order to have the flexibility, obviously, is expensive. The issue about whether it's resource efficient, of course, depends on what your resources are, and where your resources are still largely conventional resources, then in fact the environment doesn't actually enable them particularly well. So there's a need to look at some of the ways in which digital resources are stored and shared, and there's a project going on within academic services at the moment. Chris Orr and Richard Green are going around talking to people about digital repositories, and I encourage you to engage with them in those conversations, because that's going to become a significant part of the way that we do things as institutions in the future. But unless those resources are in that digital format, it's very unlikely that we'll have the efficiencies that have been promised. And the question about whether, in fact, we've changed our practices, I think the answer is actually largely we haven't. Where we're in control of the technology, and it's about us delivering with e-learning, as opposed to students engaging for the purpose of learning with e-learning, then actually we tend to repeat our conventional modes of delivery. So students will say, there's a PowerPoint, but the PowerPoint is totally meaningless because I wasn't at the lecture. I've loaded up a piece of multimedia, so-called, that the person has provided for me, and actually it's totally meaningless in isolation. So the resources are not being designed for that environment. The staff member, in a sense, is reproducing their practice. And I want to sort of pose a question of myself, really, because I spend a lot of time talking to colleagues about what would happen if actually learners genuinely had control over the environments in our institutions. What would they do differently? I want to challenge a little bit the notion that somehow the VLE is enough. And I think it's worth bearing in mind the pressure that all of these new technologies are going to bring, the new opportunities that they represent, and how we're going to deal with them. So having suggested that staff in some ways tend to work in a very conventional way and tend to err on the side of caution with some of these environments, even at those edges of the innovators, in many ways it's still quite conventional. When you look at what's happening in the much broader technology environment, all of the new technologies that are coming along. And I'm going to shamelessly go through and rattle off a whole series of things that are happening at the moment, many of which will be familiar to you. Those of you that read it's been interesting in the Times Higher recently, there's been a whole series of articles over the last few weeks about various aspects of new technology. So obviously somebody somewhere is getting quite interested. It probably means there's a hefty call looming somewhere. And those words, I think, will probably be familiar to most of you, but I'm just going to run through them. There's the notion of mobile and wireless technologies. They're not the same thing, of course. A technology could be mobile and not be wireless, and there's lots of wireless technology that you need an articulated truck to move. So there's no suggestion that the two things are necessarily the same. But the kinds of applications for learning, I think, are massively underexplored. Had some conversations with geography staff recently about the idea that you could send students off around Hull with mobile devices, and the answer was, well, they don't have these devices, it'll cost a lot of money. I suggest that almost all of them would have phones. So, you know, the idea of doing a treasure hunt around the city centre, sending out text messages to students and using their own devices, and if they don't have one, then they team up with somebody else. That's not very sophisticated. It's called group working. It's in their PDP somewhere. The idea that these technologies can be applied to almost any situation is well worth exploring. Social bookmarking is one of those areas which perhaps has a little bit more detail in your notes. That also has a learning application which we haven't yet exploited. It's the notion that you go in and actually create a web page that links to all of your other web pages or web resources. You can tag them, provide indications for other people with similar interests that your lists of information are useful to them. And obviously, I would hope that has an obvious application in many areas of learning and teaching when we want students to go out and actually identify resources, manage resources, learn those skills in information management. These kinds of tools are available quite widely now on the World Wide Web. I do wonder how many of you sitting in the room are part of the 60 million bloggers. Apparently there are 60 million bloggers. They can't all be American 14-year-olds, so there has to be somebody sitting in the room who blogs. The lights are off, so if you're blushing, we won't be able to see you. But I'm assuming there's a few bloggers. And blogging is one of those things that, again, has some applications for learning. There are some conversations going on. I don't know Linda Sallingson's been talking to staff in hubs. I don't know if we've made much progress on that in the last couple of weeks, but there's this notion that students would be creating blogs in order to exchange their thoughts and reflections with other students on the same course. It's one way of doing that. It's not necessarily the ideal way, but it provides a kind of an open publishing environment for people. I'm waiting for Peter to jump up because he's got quite carried away about Wikipedia in recent months, but there's a program that Patrick Lynch and Peter Wilson have been working on using the Wikipedia technology to actually create a dictionary. Well, no, dictionary is the wrong term. What's the term, Peter? Go on. It's an English usage guide. Okay. The Wikipedia itself, if you haven't actually seen it, you're really missing out on a trick. There are some 3 million people contributing to the creation of knowledge through Wikipedia, and they are effectively a community of people who are editing, rewriting, redrafting, developing each other's work. And it is actually, I think, quite seriously shifting the emphasis away from the value of an imprint, of saying I'm an author, I have a PhD and I print with this publisher, therefore my work is worth reading, to this notion that there is some authority from this collective authorship. And I keep reading things in the higher education press that like to poo-poo that as an idea, but I can only think that they protest too much. It's actually here already. So if people think that there is little value to it, it's worth going and reading. You may actually indeed learn something about your own subject and find that your expertise can be enhanced by Wikipedia in whatever discipline you're in. It's proven to be quite a remarkable phenomenon. Those things exist. They're real. There's no suggestion that you can't access those today when you leave the room. There are other things, of course, which are a little bit more fanciful, perhaps, you might say. But they are, again, having an impact on learning slowly. This is a screenshot from SecondLife, which many of you will have heard of. The notion that there are representations of yourself in a virtual environment, they can be two-dimensional, or they can be three-dimensional. But the notion that some of these could actually be intelligent, I don't mean intelligent in the sense that they're going to write poetry or give you counseling advice, but on metaphysical matters, but intelligent in the sense that with sufficient information and programming and awareness, in inverted commas, they can start to respond to your learning needs in a way that's really quite friendly. You'll be aware of this already. Those of you who are sitting there thinking, I don't think I've come across that before. It's the irritating paperclip that pops up in the right-hand side of your Microsoft Office program. It's essentially a moronic avatar provided by Microsoft. Takes a while to learn to turn it off. It's the first thing I think we should do when we teach people how to use Microsoft Office, turn that off. Robotics is an area which perhaps has less attraction to learning, and cyborgs are things which are a bit fanciful. I'm going to jump over those if I may. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that these are technologies which will have applications to learning, and it's just worth thinking about how that might affect what we do. The idea that computing is growing at such a rapid rate isn't just about the wow factor. Something I did last week and illustrated the fact that, you know, my PDF, the little iPod that I had, it would take a tower of IBM PCs from 1988, 420 meters high, to have the same memory capacity as my iPod. It's true, and it looked quite good on the visual I showed, but that's not really the point. The point is that there's been a lot of discussion recently about what they call the long tail. So it used to be that information that was available only lasted for a certain length of time before storage capacity became an issue, and you couldn't necessarily store things. And so doing longitudinal assessment of work or seeing how an idea had changed, modified over time, all those kinds of things were a little bit difficult. As the power increases, as the storage capacity increases, we have the richness, if you like, of that collective history. And I think that's going to prove important when people find ways of capturing that in their learning and teaching. And there's the notion of quantum computing. I'll refer you to the physics department to go and find out all about quantum computing. I started reading something on quantum computing last week and got a very bad headache. I'm sure it was the book rather than the Merlot. But there is definitely something exciting about that increase in the actual power of computers to do interesting things. That will have an effect. And this isn't fanciful. It's not something that is a million miles away from where we are right now. There's a lot of work going on. I think University of Minnesota or Michigan or something have actually done it was an American M university, has done something recently actually creating mini quantum computations with qubits using ions and something. I told you I read the first bit of the book. I didn't actually get that far. I couldn't find an illustration of our own virtual reality environment. Virtual reality is a reality. It exists. We have the whole immersive virtual environment, visualization environment here at the University of Hull. It has been used in learning and teaching already in terms of visualizing archaeology scenarios and in others. There was a piece last week on Look North. For those of you who can bear Peter Levy for more than 30 seconds, there was a program, a little clip where he described some paragliding simulations that they're doing. So it is real. It's not fanciful to suggest that this has direct learning and teaching applications. There are costs, of course, and finding ways in which we can fund learning and teaching development in our own hive is going to be an issue. But the opportunities are definitely there. I figured by now that you'd be starting to get a little bit bored of my voice, so I wanted to suggest that there are all kinds of interesting simulations that you can do, not just visual simulations of things which could not otherwise be seen in science, where you might not be able to see a protein, but you want to be able to visualize it. And so simulations or visualizations come in all shapes and forms. They're not all virtual reality. But some of them are quite exciting and actually effectively are role play scenarios. And I thought I'd share this one with you, which I'm particularly fond of.
Sleep tight, kiddo.
Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated. Simulation terminated.
All right, Mr. Bile, is it?
My friends call me Phlegm.
Uh-huh. Mr. Bile, can you tell me what you did wrong?
I fell down?
No, before that. Can anyone tell me Mr. Bile's big mistake? Anyone?
I think actually those of us that will have tried simulations will recognize the student reaction. But I think it's important to recognize that you don't need necessarily lots of technology to create simulations. Simulations can be paper-based and so on. But the technology is beginning to make a lot of these things much more exciting, much more engaging. And indeed, students are coming to expect a degree of engagement, I think, through the technology. And I'll come to why that might be in a second. I mentioned earlier, I think in passing, this notion that nanotechnologies might have a bearing, because already people are actually taking our own neurons and creating nanotubes that connect to them and seeing how signals can pass between them. And it's all a step towards this, what might seem like a very fanciful notion that you can actually put a chip with data inside someone's head and actually give them information and knowledge that they didn't have previously. The idea that you can access new memories is something that is being developed. And I don't think it's necessarily going to be that far away, probably 10 years rather than 50 years. Speech recognition is something that is also one of the things that's picking up, and I'm going to move on in a second to talk about the technologies that are already here, or the environments that are already here, for those of you who are thinking this is all well into the future. I think it's interesting to bear in mind that so many of these kind of listening devices are available in medicine already that convert speech into text, so that people who perhaps are hard of hearing can read responses that are being given to them. And indeed, there's new work going on with translation technologies to look at converting speech from one language into another via the medium of text, so a way of actually automating translation between languages. And I had to show you this clip. Forgive me, but it is Christmas. I had to show you this just because it's one of my favorites, which is, again, speech recognition in the 23rd century again, if you will fly with me to the 23rd century. Impressive stuff.
Now suppose, just suppose, I were to show you a way to manufacture a wall that would do the same job, but be only 1 inch thick. Would that be worth something to you, eh?
You're joking.
Perhaps the professor could use your computer.
Please.
Computer? Computer? Ah. Hello, computer.
Just use the keyboard.
The keyboard. How quaint.
I love the Mac. Recognize the Mac that they had on the screen. I thought it was quite impressive. The point is that actually a lot of those promises that were held out for speech recognition are still to be seen. And those of us who have sat there and trained our dragon dictate for hours ad nauseum, only to find that it still speaks Swahili, it's quite frustrating. But I think the technologies are coming along very, very rapidly. Lots of natural voice recognition, new natural language, spoken language on PCs and so on. It's something that will have a bearing on the learning and teaching, and not just from an accessibility point of view, but from the point of view of those people who are more inclined towards auditory learning styles will want to use those technologies as they become more available to us. We have to create the digital resources that will actually operate in those environments. I think the challenge for us is to think about how we'll recognize these technologies as they approach. Will we see them coming? How many of the things that I just listed seem to you to be fantasy? How many of them are you already familiar with? You may be a blogger, you may indeed be a neuroscientist, for all I know. So they may be closer to you than they are to some other people. But the point is they're coming. And the question about how we apply them to our practice is going to be very interesting. The slightly provocative question there is the second part of that question, which is, do you think you can actually avoid them? I think there were quite a lot of staff who probably thought they could get away without using virtual learning environments for quite a while, and then some miserable sod head of department says you've got to put your module specs up, so you rather begrudgingly do that. But there's a trend towards the incursion of technology into all of our practice, which we just can't resist. And I think the fact is that it is coming, driven increasingly, I think, by students. And that's really where I want to bring this round, is to this idea that the reality, which will not be something we can resist, is that students themselves are bringing the technology with them. It is no longer a question of us controlling. We are no longer institutions with the networks that no one else has, the technical staff that no one else has, the knowledge that no one else has. We are places that students come, often bringing more experience and more awareness of technology than we have internally. And indeed, often better applications. I don't know how many of you will have heard students say, well, the calendaring system's pretty rubbish on campus, and I can't use this and can't use that, but the one I've got on my Google Calendar is really good, or the one I've got on this is really good. So they actually have an awareness of the technologies, which I think we are in danger of underplaying. It's something, if we capture, we can maybe make a little bit of progress with. I think the reality is that some of those technologies, Wikipedia, blogging, so on, are here already, no question about it. The other thing that's having quite a big impact is this notion of social software designed for networking purposes. And I'm just quickly going to show you some that you're probably familiar with already. And if you're not, you'll have a spotty cousin who is, I'm sure. MySpace, if you haven't got one already, well worth going in and having a look. A way in which one simply shares ideas, thoughts, photographs, appalling music that young people listen to today, apparently, as rock and roll. And the idea that you can do this within a closed environment. People will actually say, there's a wonderful clip on the Digital Planet, one of the podcasts from BBC the other day, which some of you may have heard, where a person said, I really prefer MySpace because email's so slow, which I thought was rather fascinating. The idea that they want to share images as well. People want to simply share images, and there are sites that are available. There are, if you like, blogging sites for images, sometimes referred to as photo blog sites, where you can store massive amounts of information. And there are, in fact, staff in institutions. I haven't come across any in this institution yet, but there are staff at universities in this country who, in the absence of an image repository on campus, and indeed perhaps sometimes a will to actually get away from any central support for such things, have gone on, created themselves an account. They can log on, of course, to the internet in their lecture theatres, and they know that their photos are always going to be there. They're not relying on someone else to back up a server. They actually rely on some external organisation that they've never ever met, that they just trust, if you like, in the commercial power of these organisations to maintain systems and improve and embellish and upgrade, and that's where they store their images. And the same is true of video sharing. Those of you who will have been onto YouTube, it's amazing to think that people actually don't watch television as much as they used to. There's a declining number of people in certain age groups, declining number who are watching television and instead preferring to watch 3-minute clips on YouTube in sometimes quite appalling quality. I'm not sure what that says in the long term, but it does actually mean that maybe we ought to be thinking about whether playing a 50-minute video in a lecture is as real to students as perhaps it might have been, or as acceptable as it might have been 10 years ago. I'm not suggesting that concentration span has necessarily shrunk, but the way in which one chooses to engage appears to be changing. And the ability to produce, and this I think is one of perhaps the most important points, is that one is actually engaging in the production, not just the consumption of different means of communication, whether it's photographs, videos, or indeed just conversation and music. So all of those things are here. They're real. This isn't a plan out of a university media lab. This is stuff that's out there being used by literally millions and millions of people. And my guess is if you asked in any of your classes, you will find at least a handful of students in each of those cases who will be using some aspect of that software. So I'm going to indulge myself now and play you a little clip of an environment called SecondLife. You will doubtless have read about SecondLife. It's rather a strange place. You don't have to be there for very long before someone tries to get you to do something that's illegal in 14 states. But if you can avoid all of that, there is certainly an opportunity, I think, to engage in some aspect of learning and teaching in a very different way. This is a slightly slimmer me, but this is my avatar. I won't say it's an intelligent avatar, but this is a representation of me in a three-dimensional world. And recently I put this together to send to someone after they had read the clip in the piece in the THES. So it's actually got my commentary on it, which I'll just let play. But there was an article in the THES talking about 6 universities in the UK are actually using SecondLife to run tutorials. And they're actually getting students to come together online as individual avatars and to stand and have conversations or sit and have conversations with each other in this virtual world.
This is a flyby over the campus island environment for teaching. You can see as I fly back here to my left, the beach referred to in the article in the THES, for beach tutorials. I'm going to take you now into one of the buildings where some interesting new technologies are being added. This is a building designed for people to meet and have discussions. As many as 5 people can have real-life voice discussions as well as chatting. I apologise for walking into the walls. Those of you that know me know I do that in real life too. No change there. This is the introduction most recently of the ability to play back video with sound in this simulated tutorial space. And there's no reason why several students couldn't be present watching the clip, which does have sound, just not recorded in this version. And the atmosphere is a very different one from simply looking at a clip in an asynchronous environment and having an asynchronous discussion. This raises some interesting opportunities, I think.
I apologise for the slight slur there on asynchronous. I think it was late in the evening. I'll say no more. So I think these kinds of tools are here already. There's no question that they're here already, and it's a question of how quickly we adopt them and adapt them to the learning and teaching that we do. It's interesting when you look at the 6 universities that are currently using SecondLife, they are all in the area of e-learning or graphic design or gaming. And in a way, that's a shame, because if I remind you of that early curve, those are the innovators, the very, very early people who've got into those environments to use them for learning and teaching. But the adoption curve for those environments, as far as the users are concerned, the population, if you like, of it's an oversimplification to say young people, but I'm sure you'll know what I mean when I say that. That the community out there, if you like, that are adopting these technologies, they're already well into the full adoption stage. That technology has happened within 12 to 18 months. It's just taken off massively. And in some ways, there is no time for people to tread water and see how it works out and wait for the first conference they go to where someone may or may not have used it in their discipline to decide whether it's appropriate. The curves, if you like, are completely out of sync. We are no longer leading technology adoption in our universities. We are following the way in which it's being adopted and adapted by students, and they will want to use it. I won't be surprised when somebody comes to tell me that the first student work group has decided to use a virtual environment like that to carry on their discussions, and they won't ask permission from the university. They will go and do it externally in some externally hosted environment. In fact, if anyone knows of any, come up and talk to me at the end, because I'd be fascinated to find out a bit more about them. So my conclusion, you'll be pleased to know, and I am actually going to do this on time, which is a minor miracle, is that fusion of the social software into our learning environment is coming. We will not be able to resist it. It may only mean that we will lose control over how students use things, whereas previously we may have expected them to look to us for the environments that were being furnished. That won't happen. They will take control over the environments that they want to use. My recommendation would be to get out of that space before it takes too much resource, but that's something that perhaps is for other people to decide. They will control the amount of distance that they want. They will impose that. There will be students opting to take flexible courses in other institutions from the one that they're formally registered in and adding that and looking for transferable credit. All of those things are being discussed, of course, but what it's doing is changing the relationship to distance and to time as well. It's not just about shifting. It's not just the asynchronous environment allows you to be anywhere. It's changing people's understanding of how they communicate with each other. And I think universities will have to start finding ways of enabling that to happen. I've actually asked Linda Saddington to look into what our legal obligations are in terms of providing computer environments for people, because there is this sense in which, oh, well, we have to provide it because. But I think, what are our legal obligations? If Blackboard goes FUT tomorrow, can we be sued? Or is there a little clause somewhere that says, no, we're covered because we didn't actually guarantee you that we'd preserve your work ad infinitum? And if that's the case, if we've got an opt-out clause, then why not let them use environments that they genuinely want to and genuinely want to engage in and that really do motivate them to learn and, perhaps most importantly, are adaptable to their personal learning style. If they want to use a primarily audio environment, they can. If they want to get involved in a virtual environment that actually gives them some sense of kinesthetic learning, then they can. If they simply want to watch clips and try and read transcripts or whatever, then they can do that too. And the increased mobility of learners is going to push that rapid trend, I think, towards us having to break down boundaries. And I think perhaps probably the most threatening thing for a lot of staff in universities is the sense that somehow people don't have to come to them anymore, that we don't have control over the environments. Maybe we don't have control over our classrooms in quite the same way that we thought we did 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And the Wikipedia phenomena, which I think we might run a session on, I think we've put a session in the calendar for next year just on Wikipedia, because I think it is transforming the way that people are looking at the creation, sharing, and exploration of knowledge. I hoped that what I would do today was simply to say that the future of e-learning is still to come, that the promise did not materialize because, in a sense, our internal conventions blocked it, but that the pressure that students are bringing with social software is going to have to now break through, and students will break outside the institution in order to engage in using tools which they will then adopt and adapt for learning purposes. I have written what I won't call a vision, but actually in your notes there's an explanation in my terms of what that future VLE might look like, and I'll very briefly say that I would see it much more as a kind of aggregator of content from a whole range of different sources. So people would go in and create for themselves information that they would be pulling from news feeds. You'll have seen on BBC sites and other things little RSS feeds and icons for things. They will be pulling photographs. They will be searching eminent people's blogs. They will go out and find the professor of linguistics at the university in Illinois that they find easier to communicate with than the person that's actually in their own institution. Or they'll go out and find really interesting case studies in physics which are well explained at the University of wherever. It really doesn't matter where that university is. And indeed, they might even be looking for things in their own language if they're non-native speakers in order to reinforce. And they will do that through an aggregation type tool. So that the virtual learning environment will be very much that, virtual to the individual student. No two would actually look the same. And it's a question of whether we can just enable that. I thought I'd end with a clip. Partly because I said to Tina Priestman at the weekend, we've just bought one of these things that allows me to copy videos onto DVD, so I've gone completely mad before somebody in copyright catches up with me. I liked this, and I thought it was a useful way to end.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice. Tumbling down the rabbit hole? Hmm?
You could say that.
I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neo?
No.
Why not?
Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life.
You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
I would encourage you to take the red pill, and the Rabbit Warren, by the way, of course, is the Center for Learning Development. Thank you very much for your patience.